One of the issues when you're the foreigner is trying to be diplomatic. So I'll just start with the founder of British diplomacy, seemed to be a man called Sir Henry Wotton, who was on his way to, in the 17th century, to represent his country in Venice as the ambassador, and stopped overnight with a distinguished European family and was asked to write in their guest book his definition of a diplomat, and he said, "A diplomat is a man sent to lie abroad for his country." And so British diplomacy has gone ever since. I used to be a teenager. It seems a long time ago to me, and to my students, they can barely believe it was in the last millennium. But this conference reminds me that it was but a generation ago. And my colleague David will give an academic perspective shortly. But I have been invited to travel in time back to those years to provide a transatlantic kids Watergate experience. Actually, even that's stretching a point, since I'd just passed my 20th birthday, the first time I came to the USA. And the context in which this British student in the late 60s first came to the USA was a growing international, I presume, certainly British, perspective on the significance of the USA. Clearly, this has been growing for some time, but in the post-war years, post-Second World War years, we'd become more aware of the domestic issues that were facing the USA, and they were quite interesting, and reviews were mixed, but there were real positives. Here was a country confronting its embedded racial issues, which other countries shared too and needed to confront. It was a country confronting social issues in a way that perhaps other countries had faced a little bit before, and with increasing international cultural influence in film, music, street fashion, ideas, the contemporary debates, the argot of the time. And there were some issues on which the perspective was more mixed, and in particular its international policies in war in Southeast Asia. This British student and his Watergate context also have to be taken into account is that as a teenager and a 20-year-old, things merge together in 20-year-olds' lives. Life has many other facets to it than politics or Watergate or anything else that was going on, very important ones. But nevertheless, it is interesting looking back just to see how much impact something like this had. Now, my first day in the USA was pre-Watergate. It was actually in August 1968. The very first day that I arrived in America on a Greyhound bus from Canada, where I'd been staying with relatives. I arrived in Chicago on a Saturday in August. And actually, at the time, I was an historian. As David says, don't point out that you used to be a mathematician. I used to be a mathematician, but then I discovered American studies, and it improved my life immeasurably. But still, in American studies, I was an historian, and I knew there was an election going on, but yeah, that was about it, really. However, I arrived on the morning after the one person who was killed in the difficulties outside of the Democratic National Convention had lost his life. And the atmosphere was tense, to say the least. And I knew nothing of it. Why was I stopping in Chicago? Well, I was leaving friends in Toronto, and I was going to see friends in Minneapolis. And to the impecunious student traveller, the way you do that is by travelling overnight on the Greyhound bus, and then stopping all day and doing your tourist stuff, and then travelling overnight on the Greyhound bus. You may end up smelling a little bit, but nonetheless, it's a cheap way of doing your sightseeing. So all I wanted to do was get off, see the Modern Art Museum, see the lake, see the Picasso, get back on the bus. But it started when I got off the bus and tried to leave my backpack at the Greyhound station, and they wouldn't take it. They just wouldn't take it. And so I carried my backpack snail-like all day. It was 90-odd degrees, so it wasn't actually great weather for carrying a backpack around. And I noticed that when I approached a chap to ask him directions to see the Picasso sculpture of the woman, he flinched away. And other things happened too during that day that convinced me that American hospitality was not all that it was cracked up to be. What was true, of course, was that at the age of 20 I wore the uniform of the 20-year-old. I wore jeans, I had a denim shirt, I probably wore a bandana, quite honestly. I had hair, I had long hair. Those were days when I could go to the hairdresser and ask for a style rather than matte or gloss. And I had a long beard, and I was identified as being in one camp. And the people who were wearing the uniforms of other camps despised me. It was quite clear. It didn't matter that I didn't know what was going on at all. And as the day went on, things became more and more tense. I went into shops and I was asked to leave. I stood outside shops looking in the windows, and the police moved me on. And in general, people shouted at me. Somebody spat at me. This was a society conflicted within itself. I caught the Greyhound on and travelled around in 1968, that summer, and found there was a ferment of discussion in the cities that I visited. Now that ferment I brought some things, this is show and tell. That ferment of discussion covered all kinds of ideas, and it was informed by all kinds of things. Of course, it was election year, but also the previous year had been Woodstock, and still there were the images of Woodstock still around, the Woodstock Peace and Music badge that I picked up at the time, the peace and love image that people were wearing at the time, were part of that discussion too. But also there were other images. There was the resistance image of those who were refusing to be drafted. Also, that was on the streets and among the kids that I was talking to, and who were informing my sense of what America was about. I went home after that summer and continued another year at college, and then I came back in 1969-70 when I spent a year at Swarthmore College. And what happened during that year? Well, quite exciting stuff happened in that year. There were other opportunities to collect badges. For a start, buttons, sorry, wrong language. There was the moratorium in Washington. The first time I was tear gassed in the UK. As Lou said at a previous conference, when he was doing government, I was rioting in the streets. I thought I was just taking part. Other people tear gassed me. There were challenges to the patriotism of war critics, which they tried again to answer with their buttons by showing that their version of peace was also dressed in the American flag. They were not unpatriotic. They just had a different vision of the way things were going. There was Spiro Agnew, or Ted Agnew, yes, who was floating balloons for the administration, attacking the war critics for being the nattering nabobs of negativism and the effete snobs of the left. And, of course, it produces the badge, I'm the effete snob for peace. So the debate was continuing to go, and it becomes quite serious when, in the spring, you get the shootings in Kent State killing 4, and in Jackson State killing 2 more and wounding another couple of dozen students. Again, it was a very conflicted society that I was living inside. But that didn't mean that things didn't go on much the same as they were before. When elections come in 1970, the election materials that I picked up in, for some reason, I don't quite know why, I was in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, and the stuff there is about education, it's about social policy, it's about building hospitals, it's about all the kinds of things that politicians and people continue to do to keep their society going, absolutely rightly. So there was a strange atmosphere of parallel normality and internal challenge, and a sense of tension, possibly feeding, as I was reading at the time, feeding into Richard Hofstadter, that great American historian's perception of America having a paranoid style in its politics. And meanwhile, all this Vietnam stuff, just as John Taylor said this morning, all this Vietnam stuff was challenging the White House to the extent that it was beginning to set up the Plumbers Organisation and beginning to set into train the kind of system that was going to lead to a systemic corruption of the politics of the White House. Vietnam policy leaks led to the Plumbers. Enthusiastic and illegitimate fundraising led to unusable money being knocking around, and therefore providing the resources for the break-ins that happened. And then finally the arrests in June of 1972, the first story appearing in the Washington Post, written by Bob Woodward the day afterwards. And by August 1972, when this British student had gone back home again and come back again, now to do his graduate work in College Park, Maryland, the Washington Post had published a number of stories. And over the next 2 years, the Post was to become required reading. But the 1972 campaign continued apparently untroubled by Watergate, at least on the surface, in the Republican National Convention. This is the Republican National Convention official guide. We've got Spiro Agnew there telling people to vote for Richard Nixon because he was, quote, going to restore the citizens' faith in this country. And the McGovern Campaign also never really mentioned Watergate. It wasn't an issue. The McGovern Campaign was on the same kind of things as usual. Taxes, prices, jobs, and even where it was talking about Vietnam, it tended to be in connecting the Vietnam War to other human rights issues, the rights of blacks, the rights of minorities. And even the Maryland students who lived nearby me, but came back to school a couple of weeks after I arrived, seemed not to pick up on Watergate, though this was a year when it was in all their newspapers. This was a time when it was in all their newspapers. So the 3 British students who lived with me competed to read these newspapers, thought there was an issue there, and found that on the whole, the American community around them, apart from perhaps the journalists and a few inside the Beltway people, were not noticing where this issue was. Working from memory, I wasn't quite confident of my accuracy. Nevertheless, I decided I'd write this first and then look it up in the books. And it's a terrifically helpful timeline in the programme for today. And I actually found, when I did this, that my memory was pretty much confirmed the significant events that impacted on you as you went through this time. Even so, it's still difficult to remember what I knew then and what has been added in since. But at the time, as the Post documented the White House involvement, I was reading it in suburban Washington, D.C. In September 1972, John Dean told Nixon that nothing would come crashing down before the election. And he was right. Nixon got his landslide. But press and prosecutors were still seeking evidence. and the Senate was moving to investigate the election. And by spring '73, the special prosecutor was on the case. And throughout this time, the White House scrambled further to cover up and defend itself, leading to more convolutions, which would lead to more revelations in the long run. This student went back to the UK that summer, '73, just as the stories were being fed by these multiple sources. Why did he go back? Well, he went back to get married, and which was, on the whole, considerably more important. And his concentration was therefore distracted by all of those arrangements. And by the time the newly minted couple were back in Washington, D.C., things had moved on somewhat. The media had begun really to document the crumbling of the administration. And I thought these things had impacted on me, but I hadn't kind of checked for a long time until Lou and Drew invited me over here. So I did go into the loft to see what I'd kept. And I was really pleased, because they had impacted on me so much that this student, just married, trying to finish his postgraduate work, had actually kept the Agnew Resigns newspaper, because it did have impact when the Baltimore Sun put it in there, and the Post, and the New York Times. These, as you see, were serious and momentous things. These are banner headlines. You don't often get banner headlines in major newspapers. And just 10 days after that, Archibald Cox was fired. And again, a banner headline. Not just a banner headline, but I can remember I was watching TV that night, the night before this was printed, and I interrupted the programme to show Robert Bork getting in a car to go and fire Archibald Cox. And the voiceover told you what was going on. And I remember grabbing the phone to phone up a friend of mine who also lived in Washington, D.C., to say, this is the beginning of the end. Nixon's going to go. This is it. I didn't get through because actually he was doing exactly the same. He was trying to dial me to tell me the same story. Now, to some extent, that was a naive analysis. Lou said earlier on he didn't know whether another country in the world could get rid of the most powerful leader in the world without being troops in the streets. Well, in a sense, other countries don't have the most powerful leader in the world, so it has to be so. But other countries are actually reasonably good at getting rid of their leaders in between elections. Mrs. Thatcher went that way quite cleanly. And so my expectation that Nixon would be on his way was actually quite naive, because it was based on British expectations of prime ministerial government. A prime minister who did this kind of thing would be out within days. But it had enough impact on me that at least I kept the paper. And throughout this, while behind the scenes presidential politics became a desperate defence against an increasingly multi-layered attack, tragedy and farce were mixing freely in the public domain. We got stories of missing tapes, stories of missing minutes in tapes, barely believable transcripts peppered with unexplained expletives. The president announcing that he was not a crook. Protesteth too much. And the student, now graduated, finished this day in America by travelling around the country, and he found now, whereas 2 years earlier nobody seemed to notice what was going on, now the whole country was involved. It was very different. And so, as he passed through Topeka, the Topeka Daily Capital announced that the articles of impeachment were drafted. As he went into Chicago, the impeachment vote was in the Chicago Tribune. As he arrived in Boston, there was notice of the damage that the tapes that had come out had finally done to Richard Nixon. And as he waited to catch his boat in New York, Nixon drafted the speech. It was thought he was going to go, or the letter rather, and finally Nixon resigns. I remember actually I was in Times Square when Nixon resigned, and it came up on the flasher while I was there. So it actually informed virtually every minute of my first several visits to the United States. I was actually back in the UK when Ford pardoned Nixon, and I was unconvinced that this would solve the problem, since I felt the problem might be deeper. Watergate was a particular and escalating attempt to corrupt the governmental process, but it helped accelerate the decline in trust in government, and maybe was intimately connected with other problems in policy and politics that affected politics for some considerable time to come. Thanks very much.
It seems to me that in common with nearly all the previous speakers today, I too have a personal recollection of Watergate. In fact, it's the first political event in the United States that I can remember. But as the opinions of a 9-year-old boy in England are probably not very relevant, I'd like to talk instead about its impact on America's most important ally, the United Kingdom, and in particular on the views of the British government about the United States. And that's really a story which begins a few years before Watergate, in February 1969, when the newly inaugurated President Nixon paid an official visit to London and was received by the Labour government of Prime Minister Harold Wilson. In the course of his visit, Nixon had a private meeting with the most senior members of Wilson's cabinet at 10 Downing Street. And the President very much impressed his audience with his candour, his grasp of the details of affairs, and his pragmatism. However, towards the conclusion of that meeting, to quote one of the participants, coffee was brought in and mixed up with putting or not putting sugar and milk in his cup. The President mysteriously succeeded in picking up a crystal inkwell and pouring its contents over his hands, his papers, and some part of the table. Consternation broke out, particularly on the British side. Sir Burke Trend, the Cabinet Secretary, even poured cream over his own trousers, although it was not clear whether this was because he was so shocked or because he thought that the President would feel less embarrassed if carelessness verging on the slapstick appeared to be a Downing Street habit. The upset completely ruined Nixon's concentration. He could do nothing but look at his hands for the rest of the morning. His brilliance was all gone. The discussion never regained any verve and was adjourned early. Now, such humorous episodes aside, most accounts of Nixon's visit to London in 1969 are interesting for the favourable impression that the President had upon his hosts. Neither the Labour government nor most members of the ruling Labour Party could be described as naturally sympathetic towards a man whom the European left regarded as the archetypal Cold Warrior, a McCarthyite, and the proponent of radical right-wing policies. Vietnam was also a problem. The British Labour government elected in 1964 had repeatedly refused President Johnson's requests for British assistance in Southeast Asia, and Nixon was not seen as a man likely to withdraw America from Vietnam. And yet, upon actually meeting him, many socialist politicians in Britain saw someone quite different from their received public image. The British Defence Minister, Denis Healey, was not untypical in this respect, although he was immensely prejudiced against the man who had risen on the tide of McCarthyism, to quote his own autobiography. The President's intelligence and frankness won him over. Nixon also struck British observers as a far less imposing man than they had expected, often visibly nervous in the company of foreign statesmen and with little charisma or self-confidence. But for some, this made a welcome change from his predecessor. Both Healey and his cabinet colleague Richard Crossman reflected on how Nixon's pragmatism contrasted with the doctrinaire ideology of the anti-communist crusading Democrats, to quote Crossman, a difference which he found to be a positive relief. Although there were dissenters on the political left, for example, Neil Kinnock, a future Labour leader, was to refer to Nixon as a near-fascist during a debate in the House of Commons in 1972. Nevertheless, the leadership of the Labour Parliamentary Party clearly regarded the President as a man they could do business with. Now, this ambiguity in the official mind towards the 37th President of the United States was to colour British reactions to the Watergate scandal in 1972 and 73. Her Majesty's government's official position was based largely upon reports from the British Embassy in Washington, and in particular those from the ambassador, the Earl of Cromer, who enjoyed a close working relationship with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, if not with President Nixon himself. Although the government's papers for 1974 are still closed, those for 1973 have been released into the public domain as of January the 1st this year, and they present a fascinating insight into what British diplomats observed in Washington. Cromer's correspondence cannot, of course, be taken to indicate what he really thought of Nixon, but his letters to the Foreign Secretary, Sir Alec Douglas-Home, and the Chief Civil Servant at the Department, the Permanent Under-Secretary Sir Dennis Greenhill, show considerable sympathy for a president whom Cromer saw as being unfairly and improperly persecuted by his political opponents. In April 1973, for example, the unfolding scandal was dismissed as a mere Washington New Left liberal press furore, and a few days later, the ambassador reported that the Democrats' pursuit of the scandal was little more than an attempt to ensure a landslide for their candidates in 1976. However, as the extent of Watergate became more evident during the course of the year, Cromer moved to a more critical position, albeit one from which he lamented the tragedy of Richard Nixon rather than his malfeasance. The diplomatic establishment considered that the President would not have made such mistakes if he had surrounded himself with more astute political operators. In fact, a certain Donald Rumsfeld is mentioned at one point. And Cromer largely accepted Nixon's own view that he could ride out the scandal if he were able to persuade Middle America that Watergate was a distraction from the real issues confronting the United States. Nevertheless, by the November, Cromer was arguing that by perpetrating the Saturday night massacre, the President had, quote, altered the atmosphere in some fundamental way to make his chances of survival slim. Indeed, Cromer was not above speculating that Nixon might even commit suicide. The effect on the President's health was evident. To Cromer's disgust, his inappropriate, quote, joviality during the televised nomination of Vice President Gerald Ford made one question whether Nixon had perhaps taken one pep pill too many. In part, Lord Cromer's initial sympathy for President Nixon and then his undisguised dismay at the consequences of the scandal were the product of a low opinion of American political standards. The Great Republic, which Winston Churchill had lauded, was not how most British politicians thought of the United States. Cromer jokingly referred to Washington as a 20th century Byzantium and made regular references to the importance of his contacts with Henry Kissinger as the power behind the throne. It was difficult to estimate the importance of Watergate because, Cromer said, muckraking was an old American tradition, so one could not always take it seriously. But when the Irvin Committee hearings revealed how many of the President's associates were implicated in the cover-up, Cromer saw the scandal as evidence of the primitiveness of American politics. The American Constitution itself, he told the British Foreign Secretary in July 1973, and many American political mores are still more of the 18th century than the 20th. The US has enriched the language of politics with names of malfeasances familiar to us all: log rolling, pork barrel, gravy train, Tammany Hall, gerrymandering. To this now has to be added Watergate. Americans embark on elections with the intention of winning. Cricket, which may end in a draw, has no appeal to Americans in general, and there is no American analogy to a straight bat. Skullduggery is part of the game, and this is accepted by political parties. This, of course, is tantamount to arguing that Watergate was an accident waiting to happen, and it must represent a serious limitation to the British government's understanding of the nature of the scandal and its domestic effects. However, it must be recognised that the British political class as a whole was not much given to thinking about theoretical or moral concerns. Watergate was important to the United Kingdom, not so much for what it said about America, the country, its political system, or its people, as for its implications for the transatlantic relationship and even Britain's place in the world. The Atlantic Alliance and the imagined special relationship between Britain and the United States had been badly strained by the Vietnam War, and by 1968 President Johnson had become a hate figure to leading Labour politicians. Richard Nixon, by contrast, came to be seen as something of a fresh start. However, by the time the Watergate scandal broke, Britain had a Conservative government under a new Prime Minister, Edward Heath. Heath, of course, is the leader who took the United Kingdom into the European Community on the 1st of January 1973, and who consciously aimed to change the direction of British foreign policy from its close association with the United States to a more intimate engagement with its European partners, especially France and Germany. In particular, he had no time for the special relationship. Although Heath's memoirs claim that Nixon understood what we were doing and why we were doing it better than most of his colleagues, a recent biographer suggests that the President was disappointed by Heath and even quotes Henry Kissinger's observations that Nixon's relations with the Prime Minister were like those of a jilted lover. Nevertheless, a solid working relationship with the United States remained of vital concern to the British foreign policy establishment, and in this respect, Richard Nixon was considered more reliable than either his Vietnam-obsessed predecessor or indeed any potential alternative. In June 1972, with a presidential election on the horizon, the Foreign Office in London asked the embassy in Washington for an assessment of the Nixon administration in order to brief ministers. The head of the North America Department offered a personal view of the President. I myself take the perhaps unfashionable view that, unattractive as he is in many ways, he has seen the need for a total reappraisal of priorities and reallocation of resources, and is therefore doing a necessary, if disagreeable, job for the United States. I would add that the job cannot be completed in one presidency, but will require at least two. The sooner it is completed, the better, and it is therefore in the national interest that Mr. Nixon should be re-elected for a second term. A President McGovern, at this stage, would tend to delay the process of reappraisal and protract the period of confusion and inward-looking. For Great Britain, the unfolding Watergate crisis represented a tremendous distraction from the ongoing work of re-establishing the close relationship between Europe and America. Lord Cromer, in May 1973, expressed the fear that Nixon's foreign policy might fall victim to domestic priorities, and that the United States might even turn in towards more introspective isolationism. Within 2 months, the ambassador was urging Her Majesty's government to consider how best the embassy could promote British and European community interests in a situation in which the President was weakened politically or even replaced by another. I do not doubt our capability of living with any new state of affairs, but whatever the future may hold, President Nixon's understanding of the complexity of the international system is of quite an unusual degree in this continent, and of extraordinary benefit to us and Europe as a whole. Its loss would be grievous. By November 1973, when Nixon's fall by one means or another seemed certain, Cromer's speculation had become almost apocalyptic. I would expect the conduct of US foreign policy to be marked by outbursts of emotion and irrationality, and at the same time by a desire for quick and eye-catching tricks. The opportunities for the latter are likely to lie mainly in US-Soviet and US-Chinese rather than US-European relations, but this does not mean that they will not be sought after. It is an unhappy prospect. The only answer was, it seems, according to Cromer, press ahead with all speed along the path of European unification, in case Europe is called upon suddenly to bear greater international responsibilities. If Cromer only suggested this because he thought it was what Prime Minister Heath might want to hear, within a few months it was to be academic, because a general election in Great Britain had resulted in both men leaving office. It was therefore another Labour government which had to contend with the increasing isolationism of the White House, and in particular the problems this posed for Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, the American official whose confidence British ministers valued most. The new British Foreign Secretary James Callaghan lamented Kissinger's inability to obtain clear obstructions from Nixon's during his final days, something which was to lead to serious disagreements between Britain and the United States over how to respond to, for example, the Turkish invasion of Cyprus in July of that year. From the point of view of the British government, it was a blessing that Dr. Kissinger continued in office under President Ford, but it soon became clear that the refashioning of the Atlantic Alliance would occur only in the context of a revival of the Cold War. Nixon's fall had the effect of discrediting the President's policy of détente towards the Soviet Union. The leaderships of both the Conservative and Labour parties that rose to office in the later 1970s were both more ideological and less experienced in foreign relations. The new Conservative leader, Margaret Thatcher, took the view that the prospects for détente had, quote, been undermined by President Nixon's domestic weakness induced by Watergate. It was difficult to see any difference between appeasement and détente as it began to evolve under the conditions of American paralysis after the election of a post-Watergate Congress dominated by ultra-liberal Democrats and the collapsing position in South Vietnam, unquote. On the left, by contrast, the Labour Party retreated into the strident anti-Americanism that marked the party's outlook in the subsequent decade, when the image of Nixon as the perpetrator of Watergate merged into that of Ronald Reagan, the new Cold Warrior. The tragedy of Watergate, therefore, was not just a problem for the United States, but for America's allies as well. It served, as scandals often do, to reinforce popular stereotypes, in this case of the corruption of American politics and the undependability of American foreign policy. For Europeans, bedevilled as they were firstly by Nixon's disengagement and then by the crises of the Carter presidency, America's long national nightmare would continue well into the 1980s. Thank you.
My question is to you, Professor Weller. You discussed the diplomatic implications of Watergate. My question is, what were the implications upon the public of the UK and perhaps the public of Europe as a whole? What was the fallout for the regular citizen?
All I've managed to collect is anecdotal evidence, and from the people I've spoken to who recalled it from the time, my own parents, for example, a very useful and friendly source, they seemed to confirm the observation that I've read in the academic literature that Watergate tended, as I said, to reinforce stereotypes. I mean, my own father said his reaction was to shrug his shoulders and say, well, what else could you expect of the United States? And I would say that, of course, sounds a hypercritical comment, but that is something that seems to be common from all parties across the spectrum of opinion. In other words, from people who, in other circumstances and under different conditions, would describe themselves as friends of America, people who look, in an approving manner upon American policy. So, I think there is a distinction in the public mind, and this is probably true in Europe more widely, between specialists who have to deal with America on a daily basis, and the general public for whom, what they know of the United States, particularly in the 1970s, was not from personal opinion but from what they saw reported in the newspapers.